The road to Thistlewick was 3 days by horse, and Draven made it in 2, riding alone except for his beta, Corwin Ash, who had been trying to talk him out of this trip since they left the palace gates. "You could send anyone else," Corwin said again, for perhaps the 10th time, as their horses picked through the frost-hardened mud of the border road. "You're the king. Kings don't fetch healers." "This king does," Draven said, "when half the northern villages are dying and the royal physicians can't tell me why." What he didn't say, what he hadn't let himself think in 5 years, not once, not even in the dead of night when the mate bond in his chest ached like a wound that refused to close, was that the healer's name in the report had stopped his heart cold.
Ren.
Border healer. Unmatched skill with old moon remedies, refuses royal summons, lives outside Thistlewick with a young son.
Asson.
He told himself it meant nothing. Omega, women married. They moved on. 5 years was a long time. His wolf, coiled tight and furious in his chest since the night of the rejection, told him he was a liar. Thistlewick smelled like wood smoke and pine and, faintly, sickness, the sour copper scent of the hollow rot clinging to the edges of the village even here, this far from the capital. Draven dismounted in the square, cloak drawn up, hood low. He didn't need anyone recognizing the king before he was ready. He never got the chance to knock on a single door. A small boy came barreling around the corner of the healer's cottage, chasing a chicken with the kind of single-minded ferocity only a 5-year-old could manage, and slammed straight into Draven's legs. "Sorry," the boy said, already backing up, and then he stopped.
He went very still.
He tilted his head, nostrils flaring in a gesture so achingly familiar that Draven's whole body went cold. "You smell like my mom," the boy said. Draven crouched slowly, heart hammering. "What's your name?" "Kale," the boy said. Before Draven could ask anything else, before he could even process the boy's storm-gray eyes, so much like his own that it felt like looking into a mirror 20 years younger, a woman's voice cut across the square, sharp with a fear that hadn't been there a second before. "Kale, get away from him.
Now."
Draven's head snapped up. And there she was. Ren Hollis stood in the cottage doorway, one hand braced white-knuckled against the frame, her whole body gone rigid with shock. 5 years hadn't dulled a single thing about her. Not the dark eyes that used to look at him like he was something worth loving, not the set of her jaw when she was frightened and refusing to show it. For one long, suspended moment, the market noise around them seemed to disappear entirely. Corwin's hand found Draven's shoulder, a silent warning. Asterisk, not here. Not like this. Asterisk. Kale looked between this strange man crouched in front of him and his mother's terrified face, confusion written plain across his small features. "Mom? Do you know him?" Ren's eyes never left Draven's. "Kale," she said, voice shaking. "Come here. Right now." The boy went. Reluctantly, glancing back over his shoulder twice, he crossed the square and pressed himself against his mother's side, and Draven watched, frozen, as Ren's hand came down protectively over the boy's shoulder, pulling him half behind her skirts like she was shielding him from something dangerous. Like she was shielding him from Draven. "You have no right to be here," she said. "Ren, I didn't know." "Don't." The word cracked like a whip. "Don't you dare stand in this square and tell me what you didn't know. You made your choice 5 years ago, Your Majesty. In front of the entire kingdom." The title landed like a slap. Around them, a few villagers had started to notice the tension, drifting closer with the particular hunger of people who sensed a story unfolding. Corwin stepped in smoothly, positioning himself to block the growing stares. "We should discuss this somewhere private," Corwin said. Ren laughed, short and humorless. "There's nothing to discuss. He's here for the hollow rot, aren't you? That's the only reason a king rides 2 days to a village like this." Her eyes finally broke from Draven's, dropping to Kale, who was staring up at his mother with growing confusion.
Fine.
I'll help with the sickness. That's the healer's duty, and I take it seriously, unlike some people take their vows. The words hit exactly where she meant them to. But you stay away from my son, she said. Do you understand me? Whatever you think you saw in that square, whatever you think you smelled, it doesn't matter. He is mine, not yours. Never yours. She turned, pulling Kale with her, and the cottage door shut hard enough to rattle its hinges. Draven stood rooted in the square, his pulse a war drum in his ears, staring at a closed door that somehow felt heavier than any gate he'd ever faced in battle. Corwin exhaled slowly beside him. She didn't deny it. Draven's hands had curled into fists without his notice. No, he said quietly.
She didn't.
5 years of silence, and in the space of 10 minutes, everything Draven Ashvale thought he understood about his own life had just come apart at the seams. Draven did not sleep that night. He sat in the loft room Thistlewick's innkeeper had given him, the finest room in a building that had exactly 4, and stared at the ceiling beams while his wolf paced circles inside his ribs, restless and snarling, and alive in a way it hadn't been in 5 years.
Asson. Kale.
He had done the math 100 times since the boy backed away from him in the square, wide gray eyes suddenly wary, before a woman's voice had called his name from the cottage doorway and the boy had bolted toward her like Draven was something to be afraid of. He hadn't seen her face. Not yet. She'd pulled the boy inside and shut the door before Draven could even straighten from his crouch, and Corwin had to physically put a hand on his chest to stop him from following. Think, Corwin had said, low and urgent. You walk in there as the king who rejected her, and what happens? You lose both of them before you've said a single word that matters. He was right. Draven hated that he was right. 5 years. A boy who looked to be about that age, maybe a little older. Old enough to run, old enough to talk, young enough that Draven couldn't say for certain, not without asking the one question that would break everything open. Was he mine before the rejection, or after? Because if the boy had been conceived before that night on the ceremony platform, before Draven had stood in front of 2,000 witnesses and torn the bond out of his own chest to save his father's life, then Kale was his son by blood and by mate right, an heir the entire kingdom of Veremore didn't know existed. And if Seraphine ever found out, Draven understood with a cold, sinking certainty, the boy's life wouldn't be worth a candle in the wind. He was dressed and out the door before the sun fully cleared the ridgeline. The cottage sat at the edge of the tree line, smoke curling steady from its chimney, herbs drying in neat bundles along the porch eaves. Draven made himself stop at the gate instead of striding straight up the path. He'd terrified her once already, without meaning to, just by existing in her village. He wasn't going to make that mistake twice. The door opened before he knocked. Ren stood in the frame, and for one unbearable second neither of them said anything at all. She looked older, not worn, never that, but sharpened somehow, like grief had carved away everything soft and left only what was necessary to survive. Her dark hair was pulled back in a practical braid instead of loose the way she used to wear it. Her eyes, when they finally met his, held no warmth at all. You shouldn't be here, she said. Ren. That's Healer Hollis to you, your majesty. The title came out like a blade. Say whatever you came to say from there. You're not welcome past this gate. Draven's chest ached with the old, familiar pull of the bond he'd severed, still there, still humming faintly under the rejection's scar tissue, the way a broken bone still remembers the shape it used to be. The boy, he said quietly.
Kale.
How old is he? Something flickered behind her eyes. Fear, maybe, or fury, carefully banked. He's not your concern. Ren. His voice cracked on her name, 5 years of silence pouring into 2 syllables. Is he mine? The door slammed so hard the herb bundles over. Draven didn't leave the square immediately. He stood there long enough for the villagers' whispers to grow bold, long enough for Corwin to finally pull him by the arm toward the inn, muttering something about dignity and strategy that Draven barely heard. That night, he sent for the village elder instead of sleeping. Old Mabel Finch had run Thistlewick's grain house for 40 years and knew every family within 3 days' ride. She sat across from him at the inn's corner table, hands wrapped around a mug of spiced cider, watching him with a particular shrewdness of someone who had outlived several kings' worth of secrets. "You want to know about Wren," she said, before he could ask. "I want to know how long she's lived here." 5 years, near enough. Showed up in autumn, pregnant near to bursting, no coin, no husband anyone ever saw. Mabel's eyes narrowed. Delivered the boy herself, near enough. Wouldn't let the midwife near her for the first hour, like she was afraid of who might see the birthmark. Draven's blood went cold. Birthmark. Ashvale Crescent. Right here. Mabel tapped her own collarbone. Same as every king this kingdom's had for 300 years, if the old stories are true. She covered it quick as she could, but I saw it. Never told a soul, not till now. She's been good to this village. Saved my grandson's fever 3 winters back. I don't go spreading a healer's business. Draven sat back, the breath punched clean out of him. The Ashvale Crescent wasn't a rumor. It was fact, a birthmark that appeared only on true-born heirs of the royal bloodline, passed down through blood and moon magic since the first Ashvale king had struck his pact with the Mother Moon herself. Draven had one. His father had one. Every legitimate heir for 3 centuries had one. Kale was his son. Not maybe. Not possibly. Confirmed, in ink older than the kingdom's laws. "Why are you telling me this?" Draven asked quietly. Mabel's expression softened, just slightly. "Because that boy needs a father who isn't afraid, Your Majesty. And because Wren's carrying a weight she shouldn't carry alone, whatever happened between the two of you 5 years back." She stood, gathering her shawl. "But you didn't hear the birthmark from me. If she finds out I told you, she'll never trust another soul in this village again." She left him alone with his cider and the wreckage of everything he thought he knew. He barely slept. When dawn broke gray and cold over Thistlewick, Draven made a decision that would have terrified him 5 years ago, when caution and duty had been the only language he knew. He walked to the cottage alone, without Corwin, without guards, and this time he didn't stop at the gate. Wren answered the door with a knife already in her hand, a healer's blade, small and practical, but her grip said she knew exactly how to use it if she had to. "I'm not leaving," Draven said, "until you tell me the truth." "I already told you. Mabel told me about the birthmark." Wren went utterly still. The knife lowered, slowly, her knuckles white around the handle. Something in her face cracked. Not surrender, not quite, but the particular exhaustion of a woman who had been carrying a lie so long it had become a second skeleton beneath her skin. "He's asleep," she said finally, voice barely above a whisper. "Don't you dare wake him. And you have exactly as long as it takes me to make tea to explain why I should let you say one more word to my son." She stepped back from the door. Draven walked inside for the first time in 5 years, into a home that smelled of dried lavender and wood smoke, and understood that whatever happened next would decide the rest of his life. The cottage was small but warm, every surface covered in the quiet evidence of a life built from nothing. Jars of dried herbs labeled in careful handwriting, a child's wooden toys stacked neatly by the hearth, a single worn chair angled toward the fire, like it had held countless sleepless nights. Wren set 2 mugs of tea on the table and didn't sit down. She stood with her arms crossed, putting the width of the room between them like a wall. "You want the truth," she said.
Fine.
"Here it is. I was 3 months pregnant the night you rejected me in front of the entire court. I didn't know until after. I stood there and let 2,000 people watch you tear my heart out of my chest, and I didn't even know I was carrying your child." Draven's stomach turned to stone. Ren, I'm not finished. Her voice shook, but she kept going, 5 years of fury finally finding a target.
I ran.
What else was I supposed to do? Stay in the palace and watch you marry her? Raise your child in a court that already called me an omega mongrel not fit to lick your boots? I had nothing, Draven. No title, no coin, no family who'd take me back after I bonded with a king who threw me away like garbage. I didn't throw you away. The words came out rough, 5 years of silence breaking open at once. My father was dying. Seraphine's physicians had a cure, the only cure anyone could find, and her family made the price marriage. I had 3 days to save him or watch him die, and I chose. You chose the crown, Ren said flatly. Over me. Over us, though you didn't know it yet. I chose to save a man who raised me. Draven's hands curled into fists on the table. And it didn't even matter. My father died 2 years later anyway. The same sickness. It came back like it was never cured at all. Ren's brow furrowed, some old instinct sharpening beneath the anger. That's not possible. If the physicians truly cured the wasting sickness, it doesn't return. I've studied every old text on it. It's not a disease that relapses. It either kills or it's gone for good. Draven stared at her. In 5 years of grief and guilt and buried rage, that particular detail had never once occurred to him because he'd never had anyone he trusted enough to ask. Are you certain? I'm a healer, Draven. It's my life's work. She frowned harder, and for one unguarded moment, the old Ren flickered through. The woman who used to talk through medical texts with him by firelight, sharp and curious and utterly unafraid of him. Unless it wasn't the wasting sickness that killed him the second time. Unless someone made it look like it was. The realization settled over both of them, like a held breath. Seraphine, Draven said quietly. From the next room, a small voice called out, thick with sleep. Mom? Ren's head turned instantly, the wall between them slamming back into place. That's enough for today, she said, already moving toward the sound. You know the truth now. Do with it what you want. But I meant what I said in the square. He is not walking into that palace to be used as a piece in whatever game you and your court are playing. I would never. You didn't think you'd reject me either, she said, not unkindly, which somehow hurt worse than if she'd shouted it. People do things they swear they'd never do, Draven, when the crown asks it of them. She disappeared into the next room, leaving him alone at the table with 2 cooling mugs of tea and a truth that had just rearranged the entire shape of his life, a son he hadn't known existed, and a murder he was only now beginning to suspect had been hiding in plain sight for 2 years. Draven returned every day for a week. He didn't push. He'd learned, in the wreckage of that first conversation, that pushing only made Ren's walls climb higher. Instead, he came in the mornings before the village fully woke, and he helped, chopping firewood he didn't need to chop, hauling water, doing anything that let him exist near this life she'd built without demanding entry into it. Kale found him on the 3rd morning, stacking wood by the shed. You're the king, the boy announced, with the flat certainty of a child who'd clearly been thinking about it for days. Everyone in the village is talking about it. Draven set down the log in his hands. I am. Mom said kings don't do chores. Kale tilted his head, studying him with an intensity that felt achingly familiar. Draven had seen that exact expression in mirrors his whole life. Why are you doing chores? Because I want to be here, Draven said carefully. And your mother hasn't decided if she trusts me enough to let me be here without earning it. Kale considered this, with the grave seriousness only small children could manage. You smell like me, he said finally. Not just like Mom. Like me, I noticed it in the market. Draven's chest ached. I know. Is that because you're my dad? There it was, The question neither adult in this story had been brave enough to say plainly, delivered by a 5-year-old with the devastating directness only children possessed. Draven crouched down to Kale's eye level, the same way he had in the square, and this time he didn't let himself hesitate.
Yes, he said.
I am. Kale's face did something complicated. Not quite happiness, not quite anger, a small storm of feelings too big for a boy his age to fully name. Then why weren't you here? Mom cries sometimes. At night. When she thinks I'm asleep. The words landed like a blade between Draven's ribs. I made a mistake, Draven said, voice rough. A terrible one. I didn't know about you, Kale. If I had, he stopped, forced himself to find words a child could actually hold on to. I would have come for you both the very same day. I promise you that. Kale studied him for a long moment, gray eyes so like his own that Draven felt the weight of 5 lost years pressing down on his chest all at once. Okay, Kale said finally, with the simple, uncomplicated grace children so often had that adults had long since lost. Do you want to see my chicken? Her name is Buttons. She's the fastest chicken in Thistlewick. And just like that, despite everything, despite a kingdom in crisis, a wife he didn't love, a murder he was only beginning to suspect, and a healer who still hadn't fully forgiven him, Draven Ashvale found himself following his 5-year-old son across a muddy yard to meet a chicken named Buttons, and it was, without question, the best moment of the last 5 years of his life. He didn't see Wren watching from the cottage window, one hand pressed to her mouth, tears she refused to let fall standing bright in her eyes. He didn't see the rider approaching from the south road, either. A Blackmore courier in dark palace colors, carrying a sealed letter that would shatter the fragile peace of this small village within the hour. The courier found Corwin first, which was the only reason Draven learned about the letter before the entire village did. Her Majesty Queen Seraphine requests your immediate return to the capital, Corwin read aloud, jaw tight, standing just inside the inn's back room where he'd pulled Draven the moment the rider left. The northern border skirmishes with Caldenreach have escalated. She says she needs the king's presence to negotiate terms before the situation becomes a war. Draven took the letter, scanning it himself. The words were formal, urgent, exactly the kind of crisis that would have sent him riding home within the hour a week ago. Now, all he felt was a cold, crawling suspicion. Caldenreach hasn't moved troops against us in 6 years, Draven said slowly. Not since the treaty. I know. Corwin's expression was grim. And it's remarkably convenient timing, don't you think? The king rides out to investigate a border blight, discovers a son nobody in the capital knows exists, and within a week, a crisis appears that requires his immediate return. You think she knows? I think, Corwin said carefully, that Queen Seraphine has spies in every village between here and the capital, and I think it would be foolish to assume Thistlewick is the exception. Draven's stomach dropped. If Seraphine knew about Kale, if she'd learned there was a true-born heir with the Ashvale Crescent hidden in a border village, a child who by ancient law held more legitimate claim to the throne than any child she might eventually bear him, then the boy's life was in more danger than Draven had let himself fully consider. He found Wren in the cottage garden, kneeling among rows of winter herbs, and the look on his face must have told her everything before he said a word. What happened? She said, straightening immediately. I need you to listen to me without arguing for exactly 1 minute. Draven kept his voice low, urgent. I think Seraphine may know about Kale. I think this border crisis is a lie designed to pull me back to the capital while she deals with the two of you here, unwatched. Wren's face went pale. Deals with us how? I don't know. And that's exactly why I'm not leaving you unprotected to find out. I've protected the both of us for 5 years without your help, Wren snapped, old fear sharpening into old anger, faster than Draven could soften it. I don't need. This isn't about 5 years ago. Draven closed the distance between them, close enough that she had to tilt her head back to hold his gaze, close enough that the mate bond between them thrummed loud and insistent in his chest, refusing 5 years of silence, like it had never happened at all.
This is about right now.
About a boy who just found his father a week ago and doesn't deserve to lose him again, or lose you, because I was too slow to see the danger in time. Something in Ren's expression cracked. If you're wrong, she said, quiet and shaking, if you drag us into the capital and Seraphine really is as dangerous as you think, you'll be putting Kale directly into the path of the exact threat you're trying to protect him from. I know. And if you're right, and we stay here, then I bring my guard to Thistlewick, Draven said, and I don't leave your side until I understand exactly what my wife is planning. Behind them, unnoticed, Kale stood frozen in the cottage doorway, small hands gripping the frame, having heard far more of the conversation than either adult realized, and for the first time since meeting his father, the boy's gray eyes were wide with real fear. That night, the Hollow Rot came to Thistlewick. It started with the Bramwell farm at the village's northern edge, cattle collapsing in the field with no wound, no fever, just a strange gray dullness spreading across their hides like frost creeping over glass. By midnight, Old Man Bramwell himself had taken to his bed, shivering despite the fire, his Lycan strength draining out of him like water through cracked stone. Ren was at his bedside before Draven even heard the news, her healer's bag open, her hands moving with the swift certainty of someone who'd fought this exact battle in a dozen villages already. It's spreading faster, she said, not looking up as Draven crouched beside her. It started in the far north 6 months ago. I thought I had another season before it reached this far south. Can you stop it? I can slow it. I don't know if I can stop it. Not without understanding what's causing it, and every text I own says the Hollow Rot doesn't exist. It's not in any of the old medical records. It's not a disease anyone's ever documented before. She pressed a poultice of silverleaf and moonwort against Bramwell's chest, murmuring an old healing chant under her breath, which means either it's entirely new, or someone made it. Draven finished, the same cold suspicion from days ago hardening into something closer to certainty. Ren's hands stilled for just a moment before continuing their work. That's a serious accusation to make about a sickness that's killed a dozen villages worth of people. My father's wasting sickness that shouldn't have come back. A war with Caldenreach that hasn't threatened us in 6 years, appearing the exact week I found my son. A blight with no precedent in any medical text, spreading through my kingdom's northern villages like it's being deliberately guided. Draven's jaw was tight. I've spent 5 years being a careful, dutiful king who didn't ask enough questions, Ren. I'm done being careful. Bramwell stirred weakly on the bed, his eyes fluttering open, cloudy with fever. Gray, he rasped. Gray woman. In the north fields. Before the cattle went down. Ren leaned closer. A woman, Mr. Bramwell? Can you describe her? Cloak, he whispered. Palace colors. Silver trim. His eyes fell shut again, exhausted. Thought I was dreaming. Draven's blood ran cold. Silver trim on a palace cloak wasn't a Veremore color. It was a Blackmore one. Seraphine's family colors. Outside, a horn sounded from the edge of the village. The sharp, urgent call of Corwin's hunting horn. The signal they'd agreed on for real danger. Draven was on his feet and moving before the second note finished. Ren close behind him, both of them running out into a night gone suddenly, terrifyingly quiet, no crickets, no wind, no sound at all except their own footsteps and the distant, frantic barking of village dogs. They found Corwin at the tree line, sword drawn, standing over the unconscious body of a Blackmore scout in a silver-trimmed cloak, and beyond him, deeper in the trees, the flicker of torchlight that meant they were no longer alone in these woods. They're not here for the village, Corwin said grimly. not taking his eyes off the darkness ahead. They're here for the cottage. Draven's heart stopped. Kale was alone at the cottage. He'd insisted on staying to watch over Buttons, and old Mabel had promised to check on him, and in the chaos of Bramwell's collapse, nobody had thought to make certain that promise had actually been kept. Wren was already running. The cottage door hung open when they reached it, swinging slightly in a wind that hadn't been blowing minutes ago. Kale. Wren's voice tore through the empty yard, raw and desperate. Kale, answer me. Silence answered her. No small voice calling back. No chicken clucking indignantly in the yard. Just an open door and an overturned chair inside, and on the floor near the hearth, a child's wooden toy soldier, dropped and forgotten in what could only have been a struggle. Wren's knees buckled. Draven caught her before she hit the ground, his own chest cracking open with a fear so total it left no room for anything else. Not 5 years of grief, not the careful distance he'd maintained all week, nothing but pure animal terror for a son he'd known for exactly 7 days. Mabel, he said, forcing his voice steady even as his wolf howled inside him, desperate to shift, to hunt, to tear apart whatever had taken his son. Where's Mabel? They found her 20 feet from the cottage, unconscious but breathing, a nasty bruise blooming across her temple. Corwin knelt beside her, checking for other injuries, his expression grim. She fought, he said. Look at her knuckles. She landed at least one good hit before they took her down. Wren was already moving again, circling the cottage with the frantic, methodical energy of a mother running on nothing but adrenaline, searching the ground for any sign, any clue. Tracks, she said. Here, boot prints, multiple sets, heading north toward the tree line. Her healer's eye, trained to notice the smallest details, caught something else. And drag marks.
Small.
He fought them too. That detail broke something loose in Draven's chest. Pride and terror tangled together so tightly he couldn't separate them. His son, 5 years old, had fought. They're taking him toward the old Calden Reach border pass, Corwin said, studying the tracks himself. If they cross before dawn, we lose the trail in Calden Reach territory, and pursuing him there without cause is an act of war. I don't care, Draven said, voice dropping into something low and dangerous, something closer to his wolf than his crown. I am not losing my son to a border technicality. Wren rounded on him, eyes blazing through her tears. Then we go now. Together. I am not sitting in that cottage waiting for news while strangers have my child, Draven. I don't care if you're the king. I don't care what the law says about queens and consorts and who's allowed on a rescue party. I am coming. For the first time in 5 years, Draven looked at her. Really looked at her. Healer's bag still slung across her body, mud on her knees, fury and love written so plainly across her face that it stole what little breath he had left, and understood, with a clarity that should have terrified him and instead steadied him, that whatever happened next, he wasn't facing it as a king making a calculated decision. He was facing it as a father, as a mate who'd spent 5 years pretending the bond in his chest didn't still exist. Then we ride within the hour, he said. And Corwin, send word to the capital. I want every Veremore soldier stationed near the northern border on alert by morning. If Seraphine thinks she can take my son and hide behind a borderline, she's about to learn exactly how far I'm willing to go to get him back. Somewhere in the darkness to the north, carried on a small child's terrified voice, drifted the faint, defiant sound of Kale shouting his father's name. They rode hard through the night, following tracks that grew fainter with every mile. Draven's wolf senses stretched to their absolute limit, hunting for the specific scent of his son threaded through pine and frost and fear. There, he said finally, near dawn, catching it. Kale's scent, sharp with terror, mixed with something else.
Blood. Not much.
Just enough to send Draven's heart into his throat. They found the campsite in a shallow ravine a half-mile from the Calden Reach border marker. 3 Blackmore soldiers, a dying fire, and Kale, hands bound with rope too big for his small wrists, sitting rigid and furious beside a soldier who clearly had no idea how to handle a frightened, angry 5-year-old Lycan child. "Let me go," Kale was saying, for what was clearly not the first time, chin jutting out in an expression so exactly like Ren's stubborn defiance that Draven felt his heart crack open all over again. "My dad is the king. He's going to be really mad at you." The soldier nearest him laughed. "Kid's got spirit, I'll give him that." "He's got royal blood," said a second voice, cool and familiar, stepping out from the tree line, and Draven's whole body went rigid with recognition. Seraphine. She looked exactly as she had at their wedding, composed, elegant, dangerous in the particular way of someone who'd never once had to raise her voice to get what she wanted. Her pale eyes found Draven immediately, unsurprised, as though she'd been expecting him all along. "You found us faster than I anticipated," she said. "Though I suppose a father hunting his stolen son tends to move quickly." "Let him go, Seraphine." Draven's voice was low, lethal, every ounce of his wolf's fury barely restrained. "This ends now, or I promise you, whatever alliance protects your family stops mattering the moment my son's blood is on your hands." "I have no intention of harming him." Seraphine's smile was thin, cold. "He's far too valuable for that. A true-born Ashvale heir, conceived before your rejection. Do you understand what that means, Draven? By ancient succession law, he has a stronger claim to the throne than any child I could ever give you. The moment the court learns he exists, my position becomes worthless. So does the alliance my family built with yours." Her eyes flicked to Ren, standing rigid beside Draven, healer's blade already in hand. "I simply intend to make sure he's raised somewhere he can never make that claim." "You poisoned my father," Draven said, the pieces finally, fully clicking into place. "The wasting sickness. Your family's physicians never cured him. They gave you a way to control the timeline, to force the marriage, and then to remove him permanently once the alliance was secured." Something flickered across Seraphine's composed face, not denial. "Confirmation. Your father was a sentimental old fool who would have named a healer's bastard his grandson's rival the moment he learned of it," she said. "I did what needed doing, the way I intend to do now." She raised one hand, and from the trees, for more Blackmore soldiers stepped into view, surrounding Draven's small party on every side. "Kill the healer," Seraphine said calmly. "The king and the boy come with me." Ren's blade came up. Draven's claws extended, moonlight catching on them in the gray dawn light, his wolf finally, fully unleashed. And Kale, small and furious and utterly unafraid, chose that exact moment to sink his teeth into his captor's hand and bolt free. Chaos broke the ravine open in an instant. Draven moved faster than thought, closing the distance to the soldier nearest Kale and taking him down before the man could even reach for a sword. Corwin was already engaging 2 more, Beta's strength and years of battle-honed instinct, making short work of soldiers who'd clearly never expected the king's rescue party to fight this hard. Ren didn't hesitate either. She'd spent 5 years alone in a border village where danger came in many forms, and the healer's blade in her hand moved with a precision that startled even Draven. She wasn't a warrior, but she knew exactly where to strike to disable, not kill, and she used that knowledge with ruthless efficiency against the soldier who lunged for her. "Kale, run to me," she shouted, and the boy obeyed instantly, small legs pumping through the underbrush toward his mother's voice. He almost made it. Seraphine moved with a speed Draven hadn't anticipated. Not Lycan's speed, but something else, something wrong, a shimmer of dark magic crackling around her hand as she lunged and caught Kale by the back of his tunic, yanking him off his feet. "Nobody move," she said, and the crackling energy around her hand sharpened into something visibly lethal, hovering inches from Kale's throat. Or the air dies here, and this entire problem resolves itself rather neatly. Everything stopped. Draven's whole world narrowed to the sight of his son's terrified face, gray eyes wide and fixed on his father, small hands clawing uselessly at the arm holding him. Seraphine. Draven's voice shook with the effort of staying calm. Think about what you're doing. Killing an Ashvale heir in cold blood. There is no alliance in this world that survives that. Every kingdom from here to the Silverfang Mountains will unite against your family. Only if anyone finds out, Seraphine said coolly. And accidents happen so easily in dangerous border woods, don't they?
Let
him go. It wasn't Draven who spoke. Ren stepped forward, blade lowered, both hands raised in open surrender, her voice steady in a way that startled everyone in the clearing, including, for a fraction of a second, Seraphine herself. Take me instead, Ren said. I'm the one you actually wanted dead a minute ago. I'm the Omega healer who ruined your marriage the moment Draven found me. Kill me, and you remove the one person whose existence proves your husband's heart was never really yours. Kale is just a child. I'm the real threat to whatever peace you think you're protecting. Ren, no. Draven started, but she didn't look at him, kept her eyes locked on Seraphine, walking forward one slow step at a time. Seraphine's grip on Kale loosened, just slightly, calculating, considering the offer, and in that fraction of a second of distraction, Kale did the one thing none of the adults in the clearing had thought to account for. He shifted. 5 years old. Far, far too young for a first shift, which shouldn't have been possible for another 8 years at minimum, but fear and rage and an instinct older than his years tore through him, and where a small boy had been a moment before, a small silver wolf pup twisted free of Seraphine's grip and bolted straight for his father, howling with a fury that echoed off the ravine walls like something ancient waking up. The entire clearing froze in shock. That's not possible, Seraphine breathed. Draven caught his son mid-leap, wolf small and trembling and alive, and felt something in his chest break open completely. Pride, terror, love, all of it colliding at once as Kale's small wolf body pressed hard against him, shaking but safe. He's not just true-born, Corwin said quietly, staring at the pup in wonder. He's moon-blessed. Nobody shifts that early without the moon herself marking them for something. Seraphine's composed mask cracked for the first time, real fear finally showing through. She understood, in that instant, exactly what every soldier in that clearing now understood too, that killing this child wasn't just murdering an heir. It was defying the Mother Moon's own blessing, an act no Lycan kingdom would ever forgive. Her soldiers, already wavering, began backing away. This isn't over, Seraphine hissed, and vanished into the tree line with the last of her guard, leaving Draven kneeling in the mud of a border ravine, a small silver wolf pup trembling against his chest, and Ren sinking to her knees beside them both, sobbing with a relief 5 years in the making. Kale shifted back into his small human self somewhere on the ride home, exhausted and shaking, curled asleep against his father's chest for the entire journey back to Thistlewick. Ren rode close beside them, never more than an arm's length away, as though the distance from earlier that night had permanently rearranged something in her. Nobody spoke much until they reached the cottage, where Mabel, bandaged, furious, and very much alive, was waiting on the porch with the entire village behind her, having spent the night organizing search parties the moment word spread of what happened. The reunion was loud and emotional and entirely too public for Draven's taste, but he let it happen anyway, let the village fuss over Kale and press relieved hands to Ren's shoulders and murmur their gratitude toward a king they'd been suspicious of only a week before. It was well past midnight before the cottage finally emptied, before Kale was tucked into bed with Buttons the chicken smuggled in against Ren's usual rules, before Draven and Ren finally stood alone in the small kitchen, the weight of everything that had happened settling heavy between them. "You offered your life for him," Draven said quietly. "For both of us. He's my son." Ren's voice was rough with exhaustion. "There wasn't a decision to make. There was for me 5 years ago." Draven's hands curled against the table's edge, old guilt finally finding words he'd never let himself say. "I told myself I was choosing duty over love, because that's what kings are supposed to do. But watching Seraphine hold a knife to our son's throat tonight, I understood something I should have understood 5 years ago. Duty that costs you everything you actually love isn't duty. It's cowardice wearing a crown." Ren was quiet for a long moment, studying him in the firelight. "I spent 5 years hating you," she said finally. "Do you know that? I built an entire life out of that hate. Every herb I learned, every patient I saved, some part of me was proving I didn't need the Alpha King who threw me away. And then you showed up in that market smelling exactly the same as the day I fell in love with you, and I hated you even more because some stupid, stubborn part of my heart never actually stopped." "Ren, I'm not finished." She held up a hand, the same gesture from days ago, except this time her eyes were wet, not furious. "I need you to understand something. I will never regret leaving that night. Leaving saved my life, and it definitely saved Kale's. But I am so tired, Draven. I'm tired of hating you. I'm tired of being afraid every time I see a palace rider on the road. I want to know if there's a version of this where we don't have to keep being enemies just to survive each other." Draven crossed the small kitchen in 3 steps, close enough now that the mate bond between them sang loud and clear. 5 years of silence finally breaking. "There's a version," he said, "where I spend the rest of my life proving I'm worthy of a second chance I don't deserve. Where our son grows up knowing exactly how loved he is by both of us together. Where I finish what I should have finished 5 years ago and end my marriage to a woman who murdered my father and tried to kill my son tonight, legally, publicly, and without a single ounce of guilt." Ren's breath caught. "You do that? Break the alliance, knowing what it might cost the kingdom?" "I already know what staying costs," Draven said quietly. "It cost me 5 years with you. 5 years with him. I'm done paying that price for a peace that was never real to begin with." He reached out, slow enough that she could pull away if she wanted to, and pressed his palm gently against her cheek. The first time he touched her in 5 years, and the bond between them roared to life like it had never once gone quiet. Ren didn't pull away. "If you're doing this," she whispered, "you're doing it because you want to. Not because of the bond. Not because of Kale. Because you actually want me." "Ren Hollis," Draven said, voice breaking on her name for the second time in a week. "I have wanted you every single day for 5 years. I was just too much of a coward to admit it until I nearly lost you both tonight." She kissed him first. The road back to the capital was very different from the road that had brought Draven to Thistlewick 2 weeks earlier. This time, he rode at the head of a full royal procession, his personal guard, Corwin, at his side, and, in a carriage behind him, Ren and Kale, along with Mabel, who had insisted on coming as a formal witness and would not be talked out of it under any circumstances. The capital had already heard fragments of the story by the time they arrived. Rumors of a hidden heir, of an attack in the northern woods, of a queen who'd fled the border with her personal guard rather than return home. The court that gathered in the Great Hall 3 days later was tense with an energy Draven had never felt in 5 years of ruling. Seraphine stood before the assembled nobility in chains, her composure finally, fully cracked, flanked by 2 of her soldiers who'd been captured trying to cross back into Calden Reach territory and had given full confessions in exchange for leniency. The Moon Priestess, ancient and solemn, stood at the center of the hall, having already confirmed what half the court suspected the moment Kale walked in beside his mother, the Ashvale crescent, unmistakable on his small collarbone, and the moon blessing that had let a 5-year-old shift for the first time in a moment of pure, desperate love. Lady Seraphine Blackmore, the moon priestess, intoned, "You stand accused of regicide against King Alaric Ashvale, of conspiracy against the crown, and of attempted murder of a true-born heir. How do you answer these charges?" Seraphine's chin lifted, defiant even now. "I answer that I did what was necessary to protect an alliance my family bled to secure. Everything I did for Vermore's stability." "You did it for power," Draven said, stepping forward, his voice carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "You poisoned my father slowly enough to force my hand, then finished the job once the marriage secured your family's position. You tried to murder a child in cold blood rather than lose your seat on this throne. There is nothing noble in what you did, Seraphine. There never was." The hall erupted into murmurs. Nobles who had spent 2 years quietly tolerating Seraphine's cold ambition suddenly finding their voices now that the truth stood undeniable before them. The moon priestess raised a hand for silence. "By ancient law," she said, "the punishment for regicide is exile beyond the moon's protection, stripped of pack, stripped of name, stripped of any claim to Lycan kinship, cast beyond Vermore's borders, never to return." Her eyes moved to Draven. "The marriage bond between King Draven and Lady Seraphine is hereby dissolved, as it was built upon deception and murder, and holds no true weight before the Mother Moon." Seraphine was led from the hall in silence, her family's alliance in ruins, her ambitions ending exactly where they'd begun, in exile alone. The moon priestess turned next to Kale, who stood close against Ren's side, gray eyes wide as he took in the enormous hall full of watching nobles. "Come forward, young one," she said gently. Kale glanced up at his mother, who nodded, and walked forward with a courage that made Draven's chest ache with pride. The priestess knelt before him, examining the crescent mark on his collarbone with careful reverence. "This child bears the true Ashvale crescent," she announced to the hall, "conceived within a bond blessed by the Mother Moon herself, before that bond was ever broken. By ancient law, he is recognized as legitimate heir to the throne of Vermore, regardless of the circumstances of his birth or the rejection that followed it." The hall fell utterly silent. "Furthermore," the priestess continued, "the moon blessing that allowed this child to shift 5 years before the natural age marks him as touched by the Mother Moon's own favor, a sign this court has not seen in 3 generations, of a bloodline the moon herself intends to protect." Draven watched his son stand tall in the center of the great hall, 5 years old and utterly unaware of the history he'd just rewritten, and felt something in his chest finally, fully settle into place. Ren crossed the hall to stand beside them both, and for the first time since that terrible night 5 years ago, nobody in Vermore's court dared whisper a single word against her. Court proceedings and legal declarations were one thing. Healing 5 years of hurt was another entirely, and Draven understood. In the weeks that followed the trial, that winning Ren back wasn't a battle that ended with a single dramatic rescue in a forest ravine. She moved into the palace, but not into his rooms. She and Kale were given a wing of their own, and though the entire court now knew and largely accepted the truth of Kale's parentage, Ren made it clear, gently but firmly, that she would not be rushed into anything that looked like the life she'd been denied 5 years ago. "I need to know this is real," she told him one evening, both of them sitting on a balcony overlooking the palace gardens while Kale chased fireflies below with a young guard's daughter he'd befriended within his first week at court. "Not the bond talking. Not guilt. Not even Kale. I need to know you'd choose me even if none of that existed." "I choose you," Draven said, "because when I'm with you, I remember what kind of man I wanted to be before this crown taught me to be careful instead. You make me better, Ren. You always did. I was just too afraid to admit how much I needed that." It wasn't a single conversation that healed things between them. It was dozens, spread across weeks, some tender, and some sharp with old resentment finally finding air after years of suppression. Ren told him, in painful detail, about giving birth alone in a cottage with no midwife she trusted, about the years of scraping by on a healer's meager income while raising a son who asked, more often than she could bear, why he didn't have a father like other children. Draven told her, in turn, about 2 years of a marriage built on cold formality and mutual suspicion, about the moment he'd realized his father's death didn't match anything the physicians had promised, about 5 years of a mate bond that never fully faded no matter how hard he'd tried to bury it beneath duty and denial. I used to think love was something a king couldn't afford, he admitted one night. That it made you weak, made you vulnerable to exactly the kind of manipulation Seraphine used against me. I was wrong. Love isn't what made me weak enough to lose you. Fear did that. Cowardice did that. Love is the only thing that's made me strong enough to actually fight for something worth having. Slowly, carefully, the walls between them began to come down, not all at once, not without setbacks, but steadily, the way trust rebuilds after it's been shattered. One honest conversation at a time. It was Kale, in the end, who finally pushed them the last distance. "Are you going to get married again?" he asked one morning at breakfast, with the casual bluntness only a 6-year-old could manage, having just celebrated his birthday with a party the entire palace staff had insisted on throwing. "Because Mira in the kitchen said kings and queens always get married, and I want to be there if you do it. I want to wear the little sword Corwin gave me." Draven caught Ren's eye across the table, and something passed between them. Not quite a decision, but the beginning of one. "Would you like that?" Draven asked her quietly, once Kale had run off to find Corwin and discuss appropriate ceremonial sword etiquette. "Truly? Not because the court expects it. Not because of Kale's claim to the throne. Because you want it." Ren reached across the table and took his hand, the first time she'd initiated that kind of touch since arriving at the palace, and for the first time in 5 long years, Draven Ashbale felt something in his chest that could only be described as hope. "Ask me properly," she said, "and find out." He asked her 3 weeks later, on the night of the full moon, in the exact clearing outside Thistlewick where they'd first bonded 7 years ago, a detail Ren hadn't expected him to remember, let alone honor. The whole village had gathered without either of them fully realizing it was happening, Mabel having quietly organized the entire affair over the preceding week under the guise of a harvest gathering that Ren, distracted by court business, hadn't questioned. Kale stood at the center of it all, beaming, clutching a small velvet box he'd been entrusted to carry, the Ashvale betrothal ring, passed down through 6 generations of kings, resized to fit a hand that had waited 7 years to wear it. "Ren Hollis," Draven said, kneeling in the same moonlit clearing where he'd first claimed her as his mate, surrounded now not by a palace court but by the village that had sheltered her and their son through 5 years of exile his mistakes had caused. "I broke a promise to you once, in front of 2,000 strangers who never understood what we had. I want to make a new one now, in front of the people who actually know your heart, the people who watched you build a life out of nothing and turn it into something extraordinary." Ren's eyes were bright with tears, one hand pressed to her mouth. "I promise you," Draven continued, "that I will never again choose duty over you. I will never again let fear convince me that loving you is a weakness instead of the greatest strength I have. I promise to be the father Kale deserves and the partner you should have had from the very beginning. I love you, Ren. I have loved you every single day of the last 7 years, even the 5 I spent too afraid to say it. Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving that love was always real?" Ren was laughing and crying at the same time, the particular joy of someone who'd waited years for a moment she'd once believed would never come. "Yes," she said, pulling him up before he could even finish reaching for the ring, kissing him in front of the entire cheering village, in front of their son, beneath the same full moon that had blessed their bond 7 years ago and never once, despite everything, truly let it break. Cale cheered loudest of all, sword forgotten, launching himself at both his parents' legs with the pure, uncomplicated joy of a child whose entire world had just clicked perfectly into place. "Does this mean I get to be a prince now?" he asked, once the celebration had settled enough for anyone to hear him. "A real one? With a crown and everything?" "You've been a prince the whole time, little wolf," Draven said, lifting his son onto his shoulders as the village around them broke into music and dancing. "The crown was just waiting for us to catch up." The wedding took place at midwinter, beneath Vermore's great hall's vaulted ceiling, with the entire kingdom's nobility in attendance, though Draven made certain, this time, that the village of Thistlewick sat in seats of honor near the front, Mabel included, dressed in her finest shawl and looking thoroughly unbothered by the grandeur around her. Wren wore a gown the color of moonlight on snow, and when she walked down the aisle with Cale proudly at her side, insisting, at his own request, on walking his mother to her own wedding, there wasn't a dry eye left among the villagers who'd watched her build a life from nothing. The Moon Priestess found them beneath a temporary altar built specifically to mirror the night sky, and when she declared the mate bond formally, publicly restored, no rejection standing between them any longer, no political marriage clouding the truth, the roar that went up from the assembled crowd shook the rafters. But the true work of rebuilding Vermore didn't end with the wedding. In the months that followed, Draven threw himself into repairing the damage 2 years of Seraphine's cold rule had left behind, reopening trade routes with villages the former queen had neglected, funding healers' guilds across the northern territories to ensure no future blight could spread unchecked the way the Hollow Rot once had, which, once its true origin as Seraphine's engineered plague was confirmed, was finally fully eradicated. Wren took to her new role not as a distant, ceremonial queen, but as something Vermore had never quite had before, a healer queen, establishing free clinics in every major town, training a new generation of healers in the old moon remedies she'd spent 5 years perfecting alone in a border cottage. The people who once might have dismissed her as an unworthy Omega now spoke her name with genuine reverence. Cale grew into his role slowly, the way children do, some days full of the giddy excitement of palace life, other days homesick for the quiet simplicity of Thistlewick, for Buttons the chicken and the woods behind the cottage he'd once called home. Draven made sure they visited often, unwilling to let his son lose the roots that had shaped him into someone so unshakably brave. Corwin remained Draven's steadfast beta and closest friend, though he found himself, much to his own surprise, increasingly occupied by Mabel's sharp-tongued granddaughter, who'd moved to the capital to help run the new Healers Guild and seemed entirely unimpressed by his Royal Guard credentials, a fact Draven found endlessly entertaining. And slowly, the kingdom of Vermore began to heal, not just from the Hollow Rot, not just from the political wound Seraphine's schemes had carved into it, but from something deeper, a cynicism that had crept into the court over years of cold, careful rule gave way, gradually, to something the older generation remembered from decades past, a kingdom that believed, once again, in the old stories about love and moonlight and second chances. A year after the wedding, on a warm summer evening, Draven found Wren in the palace gardens, one hand resting against her stomach with an expression he recognized instantly, the same careful, wondering look she must have worn 7 years ago, in a healer's tent, discovering a bond neither of them had expected. "You're certain?" he asked, crossing the garden to her, heart already hammering. "Very certain," Wren said, smiling through happy tears. "A sister for Cale, if the old moon charts are right. Due in the depths of winter." Draven pressed his forehead to hers, overwhelmed by a joy he'd once believed himself unworthy of, a second child, conceived not in secrecy and fear, but in a marriage built entirely on honesty, on hard-won trust, on a love that had survived rejection, murder, war, and 5 years of separation, and come out stronger for having endured it all. Cale, when told the news, greeted it with the same blunt enthusiasm he brought to everything. "Good," he announced. "Now I'll have someone to teach how to be a good wolf. I'm already really good at it." "You shifted 5 years early," Draven pointed out, laughing. "I'm not sure good at it fully covers what happened." "That's what I said," Cale replied, entirely unbothered, already running off to tell Buttons the chicken, who had, against all royal decorum, been given a permanent coop in the palace gardens, the exciting news. That night, standing on the same balcony where Wren had once demanded he prove his love was real, Draven watched the full moon rise over Vermore's spires and understood, with a certainty that settled deep into his bones, that he had finally, fully become the king, and the man he was always meant to be. Not a king who chose duty over love. A king who understood, at last, that love and duty were never truly separate things at all, that protecting his kingdom and protecting his family had always been the exact same fight, and that the only real mistake he'd ever made was believing otherwise. Winter came, and with it a daughter, Alara Ashvale, born beneath a full moon exactly as the old moon charts had promised, with her mother's dark hair and, tucked just beneath her collarbone, unmistakably, the Ashvale crescent. Word spread through Vermore within days. The kingdom's healer queen had given the realm a second moon-blessed heir, a sign the old stories said came only once in a generation, and yet here it was, twice in one family, in one impossible, extraordinary love story that had begun with rejection and ended, against every reasonable expectation, in exactly the kind of happiness fairy tales promised and reality so rarely delivered. Cale, 7 years old now and utterly devoted to his baby sister despite his early insistence that he didn't need a sibling getting in the way of important wolf training, spent that first winter teaching Alara's cradle-side chicken collection. Buttons had, somehow, multiplied the finer points of palace life, whether the chickens wanted the education or not. Wren ruled beside Draven not as a quiet, ornamental queen, but as the beating heart of everything good Vermore had become, a kingdom known now, across every neighboring territory, not for the cold ambition that had once nearly destroyed it, but for a healer queen's clinics, a king who'd learned humility the hardest way possible, and 2 children who would grow up never once doubting how deeply they were loved. On the anniversary of that first market day encounter, the day a small boy had tugged on a stranger's cloak and changed the entire course of a kingdom's history, Draven and Wren returned to Thistlewick, as they did every year, walking together through the same square where everything had begun. "Any regrets?" Wren asked him, watching Cale race Alara's older cousin through the market stalls while old Mabel, now the honored royal grandmother of Thistlewick in everything but blood, called out warnings neither child listened to. Draven pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her temple, watching their family fill a small border village with a joy it had once feared losing entirely. "Only one," he said. 5 wasted years I'll spend the rest of my life making up for." "Good thing," Wren said, smiling against his shoulder. "We've got forever to work with." Above them, the moon rose full and silver over Vermore, exactly as it had the night this story began, except this time, there was no rejection waiting beneath it. Only a family, finally, fully whole. The end.